We would like to suggest that you read the book before you watch this movie. It isn't an obligation, of course, but we feel that it will enhance your appreciation of the noble gentleman that you're going to meet here. I'm Martin King, and this is my co-writer, Michael Collins. I've spent countless hours here in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. It's one of the most picturesque places in the whole of Europe. It's peaceful now in those lush green forests and rolling hills, but back in December 1944, Belgium was experiencing its worst winter in living memory. Michael and I would like to take this opportunity to introduce you to some of our dear friends. These are the voices of men who witnessed the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle in United States military history. They experienced the Second World War at its very worst, in the most inhuman conditions imaginable. They saw things that we'll never see. They did things that we'll never do and displayed extreme courage against a determined enemy. They liberated Europe and helped to defeat the most evil regime the world had ever seen. They were prepared to give everything to achieve this goal, and all they ask is that we listen and learn, and that's the least we can do. So let's honor their memories, honor their names, honor their deeds, and preserve their stories for this generation and generations to come. They've earned it.
My name is Theodore James Paluch, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion.
On the 17th of December 1944, Ted Paluch of Battery B 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was sent up to the line with his unit to see how far the German advance had reached. They unwittingly headed into the path of a huge SS convoy and came under attack as they reached Bastogne, not far from Malmedy. The massacre that occurred there was a pivotal event that changed the psyche of the American soldier during the Battle of the Bulge, when more than 86 defenseless soldiers from the 285th were murdered in this field of Bastogne, Belgium. The war became even more personal for the average GI. The phrase, "take no prisoners," became part of the American soldier's motto. Ted Paluch recalls precisely what occurred on that fateful day in December 1944. Where were you when the Battle of the Bulge actually began?
I was in Schevenhut, Germany. We got orders, I was in the 1st Army, got orders to move to the 3rd Army. And on the 17th, we were moving in convoy. And on the way, I noticed a couple Germans standing there, and it was woods. It was 3 Germans, and they were about 10, 15 feet apart, and no vehicle there or nothing. We just said, we were wondering why they were there. And down the road, we saw parachutes in the trees, and then didn't think of it until I read a book about a German paratrooper staying on the road waving to us as we went by. So we went to Malmedy. There was one got sick on one of the trucks, and the other truck, there was buddies in there, so both trucks stopped for medical attention. The rest of the outfit went through. And as we hit 2.5 miles from Malmedy, Benez, there's a T-road there. Well, we were coming down, took the right, and the Germans were coming up the other way towards us. And when our vehicle got so far down, the lead vehicle, they fired on the lead vehicle and it stopped the column. And we all got out, and there was a lot of firing. I don't know what we were firing at, but there was a lot of firing. I never saw so many tracer bullets go across the road. Now, I could stand in the ditch and it come up to about my knees, I guess, my chin. It was so deep there. And the ones in the lead convoy there, they could get in the woods. The Germans weren't up there as yet. Then they had a tank with a couple of SS troopers behind, come down and put the gun down in the valley. All we had was carbines. We were observing battery. And we took prisoners, and we went up to the crossroads here. They searched us, took cigarettes, had a pair of socks, watch, anything of value they took. By the way, I did get paid for some of that. We made a list of what we lost and got paid for that. From there, they put us in a field, and then every tank and half track that came around, I think there was something 96 of them, came around, fired into the group. and laid there, I guess, for a couple hours. And it was getting dark. It was starting to get dark, and someone hollered, "Let's go." I got up and start running down the little dirt road there, and that was their front line. And German SS trooper came out, took a couple shots at me, and I dove into it was a break in the hedgerow. I dove into that, and he came up and looked at me. He didn't come in, he just looked the outside and went back. He could have shot me then if he wanted to, right in the back. And I laid there and watched them come out and pump water. They didn't have no running water on the inside and getting it through the pump. So I laid there for a little while, and I noticed there was a little break, a little, I guess, hill right behind me there, and I just rolled to the hill. And I start walking, I came up to a crossroad, or railroad tracks, and I followed that. I figured that'd be the best thing. So then I met with a fellow from our outfit, and then a guy from the 2nd Division, I think his name was Anderson, and another fellow, I don't know what outfit he was from, and we all come in together. Well, they were shot in the leg and all. We helped them in, and we got into Malmedy, and they blocked the road, but didn't block anything on the railroad tracks or anything. We came right into the center of the city there, and then we were examined, and anything we wanted, morphine, anything we wanted, any drugs we wanted. I didn't take any. I'm glad they didn't. And that was about it there. And I saw guys come in with both arms, both legs, shot across the stomach, and blood just coming out of his mouth like a spigot. And he left the next day. His name was Cobbler. Yeah. I saw his, when I was over there in '96, I saw his burial place over there.
What were you thinking when you were in the field?
Trying to get away. Yeah, that's all you were thinking about, is which way to go and how to get away. I think to get away, you didn't even notice it was cold. It was cold, and you didn't even notice that. You didn't, nothing. Just the idea of getting away. And I guess I was praying too, because I could hear other people praying too. But just getting away, what direction to go, and things of that nature. You figured you were captured, maybe taken back in prison camp. That's what I thought might probably happen if I was caught, but I didn't expect that. While we were there, laying in the ground, that was their front line, and that's where they had stationed in that bar or house there, whatever it was. And they came around, anyone that was moaning, they shot. And there was proof of that afterwards, too. The shells were found there. Yeah, I just laid still. That's all I could do. And I guess he didn't notice, that's all. I saw a lot of them afterwards. Piper, I saw him, and he could speak pretty good English, too. And he was a real soldier, and I saw some of the others. I think it was in Munich, right after the war.
What did you do after the war?
Got drunk every night for about 4 or 5 months, I guess. Then went back to work.
What was it like to meet other survivors after the war?
Oh, we met every year, I guess, up until 3 or 4 years ago. But there was hardly any of us left then. So everyone's getting old, couldn't drive and different things, and so we called it quits. I kept in contact with one of the survivors in Pittsburgh, Al Valenzi, and he passed away last April. And I have no contact with any of the others now. I think there's 1 or 2 left besides myself.
Lieutenant Colonel James Majelis is the most decorated officer in the history of the All-American 82nd Airborne Division. Maggie, as he's known to his friends, was awarded more than 30 medals. He was personally selected by General James Gavin as the most outstanding officer of the 82nd Airborne Division. In December 1944, Maggie was sent with his comrades of the 82nd to the tiny Belgian village of Werbemont. They spent 13.5 frozen hours in the backs of open trucks to reach the destination. Their job was to check the advance of SS Kampfgruppe Piper in the north of the Ardennes, and within hours of arriving, they went into action. Maggie's scout was Albert Tarbell, a Native American Mohican who Mike Collins interviewed for our book. Sadly, Albert passed away before we could film him. James Majelis wrote and read the eulogy at his funeral.
I'm James Majelis. My origin originally was in the state of Wisconsin, presently live in Texas. My friends and colleagues call me Maggie. I joined the paratroopers early on in '43, and then was shipped out to Africa, where I joined the 82nd and fought all through Italy. Was wounded twice at the Battle of the Bulge, and so I was 2.5 years overseas, all the while with the 82nd Airborne Division, and all the while with the same rifle company, first as the platoon leader and then as the company commander. My story is quite unusual in that when we were relieved in Holland to return back to Paris and refit and regroup, receive replacements, and await our next assignment, instead of going back to Paris with my regiment, I was sent over to Leicester, England, which was our rear headquarters, where we had left when we went into Holland. And I'd gone back to Leicester because there were several hundred replacements waiting there for reassignment. We left England and started back on our trip, crossed the Channel and got on 40 and 8s in Paris, and I arrived in Soissons, France, in dusk. It was about dusk on the 17th of December. The Germans had broken through earlier, but no one really knew what the situation was. It was so fluid. They didn't know how far they had advanced. They didn't know what was happening. The information was sparse, but it was that kind of a situation. And when I arrived there, we were met with trucks from the 82nd Airborne Division, and then we loaded on to go into the division area, into the regimental area. And I sat up front with one of my old buddies that I knew from back in the States, and he said to me, "Maggie," he says, "we're pulling out in the morning." Now imagine, I just come from London, we just were through in Holland, and here's my buddy saying we're pulling out in the morning. I couldn't believe it. We had no indication there was anything really was going on, and really hadn't hit the news yet. And when I got back to the company area, it was all lit up. The orderly room was lit up. Guys were packing their things and putting them away. Everybody was preparing for the holidays. Yeah. The orderly rooms were lit up. There were Christmas trees. A lot of our men were gone. And that night, there was a call from 18th Airborne Corps down to General Gavin, who was dressing for dinner. And his aide said that someone from 18th Airborne Corps called, all excited. And he said, he tried to explain what was happening, but he really didn't know. But he was excited, and he said, and General Ridgway is gone, and General Gavin, you're the Corps commander, acting Corps commander. And alert the 82nd and the 101st. So they did. That was the night of the 17th. We piled on not the deuce and a halves, but we piled on what I called cattle trucks. Yeah. Reminded me of what we put cattle in. There weren't any seats, there weren't anything. There was no cover on it at all. And trucks pulled up, and we loaded onto these trucks with the equipment that we had. But more than that, and I'll never forget, is with the clothes on our back. Now, jump clothes were cotton. They weren't wool clothes. They weren't winter clothes. Right. They were regular clothes and leather boots in snow that, as in many places, was 2 feet deep. We were not prepared for winter fighting. That's right. The Germans were. Yeah. The Germans had planned this. They planned all aspects of it. Their men came, and they were in heavy uniforms and white on the outside, camouflage, so they'd blend in with the trees and the background and so on, and all of that. And we started out in trucks, headed for Belgium. Where and why and where the Germans were, we did not know. Right. We had no hard facts, no hard intelligence as to what was happening. And in the military, as you know, in the absence of cold facts, rumors take over. Yeah. So it was all kinds of rumors as to what was going on and what was happening. Yeah. We did know one thing, that the Germans were on the rampage, had broken through our lines. We weren't sure how far they'd gone, how many units or anything else. So we sat in these trucks when we left Soissons, France, heading for Belgium, for parts unknown, to make contact. Our mission was find the lead elements of the German panzer units and stop them.
Yeah.
And turn them back.
Yeah.
That was our mission.
Yep.
That's all they could tell us. So in the absence of facts, we would sit in his truck and we'd be talking about it. I sat with my company commander, Captain Karl Kappel, and we sat down. We had no seats in these trucks. And we discussed everything. But one thing I remember leaving in the morning, and I looked up and it was a fairly clear sky. That is, it was suitable for aircraft, including the Luftwaffe could have flown. And we kept speculating that we would be a beautiful target for the Luftwaffe moving along in these state trucks full of guys without any anti-aircraft cover, without any kind of support, without any kind of air support, heading for Belgium.
Yeah.
And I remember coming into Belgium, and in every little town that we went through, there was a sign, just a kind of a little square sign, maybe a foot by 3. And I always remember the one that said Bastogne. I never heard of it before.
No.
I didn't know what it was.
Right.
But it was a German town. And as we went in past this sign, people were coming out the street and waving at us.
Yeah.
They were waving at us.
Yeah.
We were, after all, they're liberators at that point. And I never forgot that. I didn't realize at the time that that would be a major battleground. We pushed through there and headed up towards Liège. Our initial objective was to stop at Bastogne, but since we had gotten left earlier and were on the road first, they decided to move the 82nd line up into the northern sector, where the Germans were threatening to Liège and then go on into Antwerp.
Yeah.
And so we did, and we kept pushing forward, and then for the first time we began to hear the sounds of artillery. We knew we were approaching the combat area when you could hear in the distance artillery. Up until that point, we haven't seen any evidence of the enemy, any sounds, anything. But as we were approaching this area of Werbemont, we began to hear it. So decided we would pull over and dismount at Werbemont. And from there on, we would move on foot because we were getting, like we would say, we were getting warm.
Right.
The enemy was somewhere coming, and our mission was to find him and stop him. And we dismounted then at Werbemont. When we got to Werbemont and we began to hear the sound of guns, we knew we were approaching the enemy. So we dismounted. And from that point, we were on the move. We never really dug in because we weren't attacked. We were looking to make contact with them. And it wasn't until later that we really had to dig in to stop a German advance. But initially, we were moving forward, and when we got a break, we would just lay down in the snow. Now, mind you, we went in with the clothes on our back. We didn't bring bedrolls with us. We had no blankets.
No.
We had no shoulder halves like we normally do. There really wasn't time for that to prepare for the winter. And so we did the best we could to try and keep warm in this very cold weather. But we were on the move from one city into another. And then as we approached Chenot, we got word through the Belgians, through the underground, that the Germans were rapidly approaching Chenot and the crossing of the Somme River. There was a bridge over it. And we felt that if they got to that point and crossed the river, they would be hard to stop. So our mission then was to get to that bridge and into Chenot before they did. Now, we were lightly armed. We had some bazookas. We started down this hill. We came in a line of skirmishers, 2 companies initially. The skirmishers spread out coming down this hill. And the Germans opened up on us with flak wagons that were in Chenot. And the flak wagons, they had the 20-millimeter shell, would explode. And fragments would hit guys. And we were losing people coming down this high ground and were wounded, and they were moaning and groaning. The initial reaction is, for you when you're being fired, is to take cover. Initial reaction, always was.
Yeah.
To go behind the hill. And most of the units did, but I had advanced with a group of my men, the platoon, forward quite a ways, and we decided instead of going back over the hill for cover, we would charge down in the face of the enemy and see if we could engage them. Because after all, it's a war. You don't win the war by seeking cover. You seek your enemy. And when they're in sight, you know where they are, you engage them. That was always my motto. When we started taking prisoners, we took the suits off of them. And I was wearing a white German coat and trousers. Yeah. And the guy that had it, a prisoner, was going back in his underwear. We took it off him. He wouldn't need it, but we did. We had a fight. That we lost more men to the elements than we did to the enemy. Yeah. And so I remember one night in Belgium, outside of the objective, we were trying to keep warm, had no blankets, you couldn't dig anything in the ground. And I had a fellow who was going to be with us today. He died, had his ticket. This fellow, the picture he gave to me, Albert Tarbell, was a Mohawk Indian. And he joined the paratroopers out of the Indian reservation. And he said that what he would do, and others, in a case like that at night, no blankets, you had to spend the night, below zero, they would hold hands and get around a big tree and walk around slowly, rubbing against this tree. And he said, you know, you could keep warm doing that. In the combat zone, there were no holidays. Death does not take a holiday. And I've always said this, Bill, that paratroopers, if properly led, will follow to the gates of hell and ask no questions.
William Hannigan was a member of H Company, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. He served in the same company as Lieutenant Colonel James Majelis. His brother was in the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and there was obvious sibling rivalry between these two paratroopers. William Hannigan didn't speak about his war experiences for 65 long years. I felt deeply honoured to be able to interview him for the book and the film. He is without a doubt one of the most dignified and remarkable gentlemen I've ever had the pleasure to meet. This is his story.
My name is Bill Hannigan, and I was a member of the H Company 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and we had come off the line for rest and you know, kind of repair. We were in Ramberville, France, when the Germans invaded in the forest, and we were pulled out on trucks, inadequately armed and given, you know, clothes, and we were just pulled out of necessity in this thing. Wasn't well thought out, but and we did get up to on these trucks. We were taken right up to Bastogne. My brother was at Bastogne, and I always told him that we saved his skinny little butt, but maybe we shouldn't have. And he later on, you know, being a paratrooper and in the 101st, and me in the competitive 82nd, they would ask me how many jumps I made. Whatever I said, he would add one. Whatever he said, I would add one. And we storied about it so many years that we kind of don't know, although he died. Now, we went up there, and we were put in there. We had leadership in Lieutenant Majelis and another special officer named La Riviera, Lieutenant Rivers. And we had a man that's right here with us tonight, and that's, he was staff sergeant, a platoon sergeant, and he was a real leader. His name is Ted Finkbeiner, and he was an excellent leader. And I asked him just recently, how come you never had the fear that the rest of us had, normal fear? And he said, I grew up in the swamps in Louisiana with a gun in my hand in the woods and the rivers, hunting all the time. And he said, I found great joy in it. And I thought, well, but these people didn't send us into battle. They led us. And that was important. Now, the battle is a confusion of things that I just know a very small amount about. And a couple of things I remember is toward the end, we captured some Germans, and they had been pulling back from the Battle of the Bulge. And I asked a non-commissioned officer in the German army, why, when you knew you were lost the war, did you fight so viciously? And he said, my family. He said, for 8 or 10 years, that's all we had, one another. So we protected and fought viciously for one another. And I thought it was interesting. Mm-hmm. Well, it was a question of survival, lack of equipment, and they talked about getting 2 guys in a hole in the ground, and they call it a dig a foxhole. Well, if 3 guys got in there, and you slept spoon fashion, the guy in the middle got warm, and you did that and turned it over. Now it sounds a little out of sync, but you did some things you normally wouldn't do in order to survive. I want to tell you that I spent a lot of years trying to forget this, and I succeeded. I did forget. No, 3 movies: The Longest Day, The Bridge Too Far, and one more. And of course, The Band of Brothers. They stirred up things that I hadn't thought about in years. And I come to this, and people ask me and want to know about how I felt about it. Well, I buried most of that, and now I'm getting better. Yes, we did hear about the Manley massacre when we were on the line. It spreads fast, and it's a useful piece of information to motivate us, and don't trust them, don't take any prisoners, Besides, if you look, we were surrounded. Where were we going to put prisoners? And so many times they were killed.
During the Battle of the Bulge, Ralph K. Manley served with the illustrious 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. He arrived in Bastogne on a bitterly cold winter's night on the 18th of December 1944. Within a few days, Bastogne was a city under siege. He remembers those days vividly.
Yes, I'm Ralph K. Manley from Springfield, Missouri, and I was with the 501st Parachute Infantry, 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne and War II. Yes, actually I was in Paris on a 24-hour pass after we just returned from Holland, and a loudspeaker came on and says, all units report to your units immediately, as quickly as possible, any way possible. So we returned then from Paris back to our unit and immediately got on what clothes we had, and I still had on my Class A for, of course, being in Paris, and we loaded onto Port Battalion trucks, these semi-trucks that had 4-foot sidewalls on them and open tops, whatever, and loaded onto those without overcoats or without overshoes, and headed towards the Bulge. And it was very cold. We met troops that was coming out, wounded, this, that, and the other, walking as we crossed paths, us going in and them coming out. Those who were disenchanted by having been overrun by the Germans and so on, and a truck with maybe a series of bodies on it, and as one rounded the corner, some of the pieces of bodies fell off the truck. And at that time, they had grouped together clerks, anybody that was a soldier, to go to the front. And some of those not having seen that just keeled over in their tracks, so on, because they had not seen that type of wartime before. We did not know actually what was going on. We did know, as we had been on pass in Paris, every unit every person return to your unit immediately as quickest way possible. And so as we got back to our unit at Mormelon, France, then we got our equipment and our guns and whatever, and we're on trucks in minutes and headed off to Bastogne. We didn't know of the situation. We just know it was cold, and we had to go as we were without overshoes or overcoats. And again, with 0 degrees, you can imagine that in open-air trucks going there, put in like cattle, you might say, on trucks that weren't covered. They were actually port battalion trucks that were used to hauling merchandise from the ships out to the warehousing areas. And so that's what we rode to Bastogne on. And once we got there, of course, it was just dismount and head up the road to the city. So I was out on the edge in a foxhole, and in this case, the ground was frozen, but coming out of a barn lot with all the pheasants and cattle stuff that was coming out, it was easier to dig a foxhole there, so you can imagine what I must have smelled like. And that part with a bazooka, so on. And with the bazooka, to shoot at tanks that were coming in, and certainly that's what we did, and disabled some tanks that were coming on through with the bazooka, but they got very close. So on. And it was one of, oftentimes maybe with 2 in a hole, but in this case it was just 1 because the ground was so hard to dig, at least on the surface and with the snow, and you didn't want to reveal your position because of the black dirt on top of the white snow. So you had to get snow and cover over the soil that you dug out of the, out of the foxhole. From the foxhole, actually it was a defensive position. Normally we were very lightly equipped with rapid-firing weapons, folding stock carbines, that type of thing, rocket launchers or bazookas, as we might call them, anti-tank mines, things like that, on the defensive there, as opposed to being on the attacking part. And there, of course, not knowing fully the situation, we blocked all the roads so no more could come into the city of Bastogne with our outlying positions there. And some of the people, of course, were in the city of Bastogne, hadn't got any farther than the city itself. And so it was one of really not knowing and being familiar with what was really happening, except the enemy was attacking and you wanted to stop them, and that part we did. As a paratroop unit, we were always surrounded, what have you, so that part didn't bother us, so on. Of course, we were not armed with tanks or vehicles or anti-tank guns or tanks or anything of that nature. We were light, fast-firing type of units, and so we had our rifles and our hand grenades and our anti-tank mines and things of that nature, and our explosive composition C, 25 pounds of it, as a matter of fact, with each demolitionist. So we could mold that around, actually throw it on the engine of a tank as it passed us and blow the engine on the tank to get it out of commission of the Germans. Composition C explosive is a putty-like type of thing, and by molding a ball of that and putting a fuse and blasting cap in it, then we could throw that on the back of a tank where the engine was, and it would blow the engine of the tank, so it would incapacitate the tank.
Do you remember the Germans bombing Bastogne?
Yes, they did.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. Actually, I was on the second story of a building there at that time with field glasses trying to cover the roads and see what was coming. And the artillery and bombing of the building began to fall down. So I jumped out of the window of this building, since it was crumbling, and into the street of rubble below from this building. And actually, I broke several toes in my foot, but that was so minor that you didn't bother at that until years later I had it repaired. Weather had broke, and in came planes of the Allies to help us out, and were we happy to see that. Christmas time, and of course you're away from home, and we're here to call on to defend our country, and we wanted to give it the best we could. In the meantime, the Germans had dropped leaflets for them, leaflets saying this was our pass to warm bed, and if we wanted to see our sweethearts again, and so on. The type of leaflets that was trying to encourage us to give up. And of course, that was a perfect paper for us to use to relieve ourselves, what have you. Of course, they'd play the Christmas carols that we would hear, and then trying to encourage us to the, and you can see why General McAuliffe sent the word nuts when we were asked to surrender, because actually it was probably much more than that, but that was printable stuff, so on. We kind of used some vulgar words at the time that we wouldn't use in the press or today. But anyway, the nuts has centered on for this many years from that, because we were not about to give up. But even though they encouraged us to, the Germans did, so on. But it did block their advance on there, and that was the end of it for that part. Even in digging some of the foxholes around, some of them came across the gardens that had some potatoes left and things like that, black potatoes that had been frozen and so on, but it was something to eat. And even one of us killed a chicken that about froze to death, I think, and ate that raw chicken in order to have something to eat on that, because we did not get a resupply of K-rations, and K-rations is all we had in the paratroops. We didn't have the C's or the D's or what have you, that troops that had trucks and vehicles, because we had no vehicles there. The Germans were every place, it seemed, but somehow or another we managed, despite the cold and despite the threat of our feet being frozen from the wet snow on our boots, and then we'd take off our boots and in the foxhole and rub our toes, because otherwise gangrene would set in on a number of people, and you had frostbite and all from your toes, which greatly bothered many of them because they couldn't walk anymore. Their toes had been frozen, you see. Actually, we would try to get 2 men to a foxhole so one could get, 5 minutes sleep, 10 minutes sleep, and 2 men could keep each other warmer than one man by himself. And then while one could take off your boots and rub your toes and maybe take your wet socks, put under your arms or in your crotch of your legs to dry from the heat of your body, so on, so that you could put them back on and protect your feet. And I did not get frostbite on my feet because of taking off your boots and rubbing. With 2 men in a foxhole, one would be firing and the other could be working there until you were needed, and drying your feet and so forth. But again, close to about the 16th or 17th of January, as a matter of fact, I think, when we knew it. Because it seemed like about a month from the time it started till the time that it was turned the opposite against the Germans. And of course, after that, you could take prisoners by the hundreds, so on, from the Germans, because they knew that that was the end of it. So from that moment on, it was one of not defending positions, it was one of taking prisoners from the Germans, so on, and knew that the war was over then, because at that time, when you had whole units would surrender to you, and you were not equipped, we as paratroop used to handle that many. So we might corral them in a barnyard or something of that nature and strip them of their weapons, so on, to hold them until the ground troops got there and could take over that position.
Francis S. Curry was an automatic rifleman with Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division. Here he is with my co-author Mike Collins. When Sergeant Curry went into action at the Battle of the Bulge, he was only 19 years old. His 30-man platoon had been assigned to defend a small bridge to the west of Manley with little more than small arms, facing a column of German tanks intent on flanking his battalion. Curry repeatedly braved enemy fire to inflict heavy losses on the enemy. While doing so, he rescued 5 American soldiers that had been pinned down. In recognition of his courageous feat, Sergeant Curry was presented with the nation's highest military award, the Medal of Honor. Here, he will tell you in his own words how he earned that prestigious commendation.
My full name is Francis S. Curry, and I served with Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, a 30th Infantry Division.
Where were you when the Battle of the Bulge actually began?
At that time, we were up at the vicinity of Maastricht, Holland, getting prepared to cross the Roer River. We had just broken the Siegfried line. Well, we did not know at the time that the Germans had broke through, and we were just alerted the night before and the next morning that we were going to be trucked, and they didn't even tell us where we were being trucked. And it wasn't until we were already en route that we found out that we were going down to Belgium. Well, it was in the month of December, damp, cold, rainy, typical Dutch weather at the time. I was a rifleman at the time, and I just went where they told me to go. It was the 20th of December that we disembarked there. And they said that we were going to set up a defensive line. At that time, we had heard that the Germans had broken through. And we were going to defend this. We were told our objective was to defend this bridge there at Malmedy in Belgium. This factory had been made into a U.S. Army hospital right there. And we went into the hospital itself and told them that we were going to be there and all. And starting that afternoon and that evening, they evacuated the hospital. A recon patrol had come through from higher echelon, and I heard this recon officer talk to my company commander, telling him that they had determined that German armor could not operate in that area due to the terrain, and all he had to do was leave one squad to guard that bridge. We might get some German infantry infiltrates, and we could handle it. We were in these foxholes on each side of this bridge, and of course, inasmuch as the recon had said that the armor could not operate in that area, we accepted that, and we were just semi-alert, really, until about 4 o'clock in the morning here, when the German army started coming in with their armor bumper to bumper. So much for Army intelligence. During the course of the day, we were fighting back and forth with the Germans. We sensed that we're too vulnerable in these foxholes, so we withdrew into the factory, and there were 6 of us by that time, and one fellow had already been hit pretty badly, and we had evacuated him with us into the factory. And this was a factory that was, the first story was all windows in a long hallway. And what we did, we ran from window to window to window shooting to make them believe there were a lot more of us. So one German tank did pull right up in front of us and pointed at his, we were at the outskirts of Malmedy, he pointed his cannon into, and this fellow with me, his name was Adam Lucero, he and I got a bazooka. There had been an anti-tank outfit backing us up there, and they had been overrun, but they left their vehicle right there, so we were able to get the bazooka and the ammunition, and we got to broadside of that tank and hit it broadside with the bazooka. And a very fortunate, I was the one who fired the bazooka, and a very fortunate shot. It went right between where the turret joined the chassis of the tank and kind of disabled, and they had to pull out. And during the course of the day, firing about noontime, I would estimate the kind of stalemated, not much going on. The Germans brought 3 more tanks down, and they lined it up with that one that we'd already disabled, but they weren't doing anything with them. So during the lull, and this far in the afternoon, I was going to myself, I went out to see what the story was. They were back from us, say, a few hundred yards, and while there, I saw 5 of the anti-tank crew that had been dug in, and they couldn't move because they were between the Germans and us. So I got a hold of a machine gun that crew had been pretty good killed, and I gave them covering fire with the Germans, and one by one they were able to get out, come back to us. they weren't much used to us, so they just went across the bridge and they were out of it. I could see where these tanks were, and I had a nice hedgerow between me and them. So I managed on this half-track from the anti-tank outfit to get a case of anti-tank grenades. And I had a launcher, and I managed to fire all them. Now, one thing I did learn from that is an anti-tank grenade will not knock out a tank, I found. But what it does when it hits a tank, it makes a heck of a boom, a lot of smoke, a lot of flame, noise, and the Germans don't know what. They could have been an anti-tank gun, or artillery hitting them, and they abandoned the tanks. So for the course of that afternoon, I got credit for 4 German tanks. And by that time, it was getting dusk already, and then we had to plan on the evacuation.
The Battle of the Bulge was a resounding victory for the Allies, but at the expense of almost 87,000 American casualties. We hope that you've enjoyed meeting some of the survivors, our Voices of the Bulge. There are many more, and we look forward to introducing them to you shortly.
Sorry, man. It's his fault. It's just, I know, talking about Barack Obama. No, that's not gonna. Michael! Sorry. No. My name is Martin.
Sorry. Sorry.